get lots of feedback from people like you and others between now and the end of June, when we're going to issue an even better paper. And this one is only 30,000 words long. The new one, I'm hoping, will be at least double that. And everyone is really going to want to read it, and it'll be on all the airport bookshelves, the airport shop bookshelves, and people are going to pick it up and pay good money for it. That's my hope. So it's written primarily for private sector, but there's an awful lot of it is relevant to the public sector, and particularly to public accounting. And because one of the things that we kind of talk about in the paper is actually, well, what is money? What's debt? What does it mean for us? What actually causes economic growth? How do we recognise it? How do we measure growth? I'd argue that the measures we have for growth are awful. They tend to measure the wrong things and don't measure the right things, and so on. In terms of trust, now we can spend ages talking about what creates trust, and most of them you can think of on top of your head. But the key word for me, I think, in relation to us as accountants is relevance. Now, I think it goes without saying, hopefully, that as accountants, when we produce accounts, we'll do it with sincerity and honesty and all that. So that goes without saying. What I think is missing from accounting generally is relevance. So this is a bit philosophical now, but actually, why do we do accounts? But let's start with why do we do corporate governance? Because it's a newer thing, it's an easier one to think about. Because we've been doing accounts for so long, we don't really think about why we do it. We just do it. But with governance, it's a relatively new concept. It's really only been going strong for the last 20 years or so. And I've been doing governance, for probably 40 years, but I didn't know it was governance until 20 years ago. And now everything's governance. Anyway, so the purpose of governance, if you look in governance codes, you're not really going to find much enlightenment about what it's for. And you'll probably end up thinking, as many people do, that what governance is about, it's about complying with codes, complying with requirements and so on. And that becomes the reason for doing it. And as a result, we seem to have created a bit of a governance monster, where an awful lot of people spend an awful lot of time and cost a lot of money doing stuff around compliance with codes that I'd say, by and large, is completely irrelevant to and arguably detrimental to creating value. Now, we also talk about what value is in the paper, and one can be philosophical about this too. Value, in a private sector sense, I would say is about economic value, but it's also, and you were talking about integrated reporting earlier, I think, and it's about social value and environmental value. And so you've heard this before in the previous session. I'm sorry I missed that. But I think that it's very important to think about that. And I think what governance is about is creating value. Now, in the public sector, there's this interesting thing. Now, do we actually spend value that's being created by others, or do we create value ourselves? Now, it's a popular conception amongst perhaps some of the right-wing press that we have in this country and in America and so on, that the public sector is basically a load of parasites who are basically living off the wealth created by the private sector. I don't buy that idea at all. I think it's absolute nonsense. And you wouldn't have a private sector if a public sector wasn't responsible for building bridges, for having education, for looking after people if they're sick, and so on. That, to my mind, is as much about creating value as a Microsoft might be, or something like that. But it's not seen that way. And I think one of the things that the paper's trying to do is actually hopefully give people a different way of looking at actually what value is and what it is. And I think for the public sector, in terms of trust, the key thing maybe is to think, in our reporting, to what extent are we reporting on whether or not we, and by we I mean us as individuals, us as a board, or us as an organisation, do we create value or not? Are we creators of value or are we users of it? And I think that if we were to think clearly about, are we creators of value? How do we create value? How do we know when we're creating value? How do we know if we've got the right measures and so on? And then we report against that. It would actually make our job enormously more relevant, and people would actually take far more interest in the accounts that we produce. Now, I wouldn't bother looking at the accounts of an NHS organisation because I don't think it would tell me very much. I wouldn't bother looking at the accounts of a local authority because I'd want to kill myself afterwards. What I have spent some time doing, and I blame Julian for this, is spending some time looking at the whole of government accounts and the national accounts that this country prepares and trying to compare it with the figures that the OECD put out for other countries and so on. And it was absolutely a fascinating experience. And I concluded at the end of it that if this country was a company, it would have been bust a long time ago, which is a sobering thought. So, when it comes to trust, I'm not sure the public is ready for that degree of honesty and transparency, because it would frighten us. And if we were to tell public at large that basically this country, which is theoretically a wealthy country by comparison of most, is bust, and we are dependent upon our children for our continued well-being. I think the public would be unhappy, and I think our children would be particularly unhappy. And I know that mine are, because I've discussed this sort of thing with them, and they hate me for it. They think it's my fault. When I was their age, I thought it was my parents' generation's fault, because I thought they were wrecking the world and destroying the environment and so on. Now, I think we're wrecking the world and destroying it through debt. Unfortunately, too much debt is a bad thing. So I think in terms of developing countries and the developed countries, for goodness sake, developing countries, please do not emulate the model of the developed countries. Find a better one. Be radical and actually think outside the box a bit in terms of how are we creating value. Now, this is where I want to help you. And you know, maybe I can sell my consulting services. I used to be an accountant years ago. We're actually proposing a framework. I've put a few copies of what's basically the exec summary in the forward, which I think are on the table somewhere. Candice knows where they went to. I think they're outside. There's only 30 sheets, but there's a few there to get you started. But it talks about a framework. And we have a framework that basically, it's very simple. Imagine a three-legged stool. Now, if I'm sitting on the stool, no, it's got one leg too many. So imagine this one with a leg missing. How long have I got, Michael? I'll be fairly quick now. But, okay, thanks. I won't be that long. So imagine this has got a leg missing, but the legs are in the right place. Okay, so three, and it's fairly stable. Now, so I am the purpose of corporate governance sitting on the stool. Now, one of the legs is about performance. So if it's about creating value, okay, in order to create value, you need to perform. So performance is one of those key legs. Another leg is informing, or you could say accounting. If we go back to what are accounts for, I would say the purpose of accounts is to provide relevant information on whether or not value is being created. Unfortunately, many cynics would say, and I'd be the first amongst them, that the purpose of accounting